Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
He said, I don't like them, James, because you're not allowed to clap, so I can't tell whether anyone's ever made a good point or not. And although we laughed, that's actually it's a brilliant point. He said he doesn't know who's winning because no one's allowed to clap. And that's actually a brilliant point, although also a bit silly. So we will perhaps find some time to explore those issues as well. Some grim news for the government that earmarked £2.3 billion for 200,000 new affordable homes when they were campaigning in 2015. We'll have a look at that. And Boris Johnson at the weekend, declining to comment on what the naughtiest thing he's ever done may be. So we thought we'd answer it for him today. I've got a long and capacious list of misdemeanours, acts of naughtiness that Boris Johnson has committed, and we'll begin. We'll probably do that from 12 so that you can add to my list anything that we may have forgotten. So if you want to just text that or tweet that, we'll try and keep an eye on things. My inbox is a little bit ridiculous. Of a normal morning, but we do our level best to keep an eye on things, and therefore I would love to know what you think should be on the list of contenders for Boris Johnson's fields of wheat moment. I don't know whether this works on the radio, but this is my list. It's quite big. 6 minutes after 10, and we begin with... Now, I am under no illusions as I glance at the clock. It's 6 minutes after 10, which means that Nick Ferrari's interest in my programme is already over. But such is the nature of the staff rotations at LBC Towers that I often have the pleasure of listening to him for an hour or two in the morning. And I'm not going to lie to you, on the mornings that he invites Jacob Rees Mogg into the studio, my ears do not prick up, perhaps, as much as they do when he's embarking upon one of his flights of fancy or tackling an issue that I find fascinating. Jacob Rees Mogg is a divisive politician, it's fair to say. As a result of that, I missed something that he said yesterday that put me in the even more unfamiliar position this morning of defending him. Because a colleague said, as we were assembling our possible topics for the time that we spent together, you and me, a colleague said, have you seen what Rees Mogg said about Grenfell? And I said, what? And he said, he's blamed it on the victims. I said, pardon? He said, anyone with any common sense would have disobeyed the fire brigade and came out. And I owe an apology to my colleague because I used a rude word to describe that claim. You can probably guess what it is. No? No. Well, BS would be the... I thought that he had got it wrong. I genuinely thought he must have misread it or over-egged the pudding or simply got the wrong end of the stick. The idea of a senior politician responding to questions about the most terrible peacetime tragedy this city has ever seen by suggesting that the people who died lacked common sense is, at this point in proceedings, actually beyond me. I couldn't quite believe it. So, I checked.
The tragedy came about because of the cladding, leading to the fire racing up the building, and then was compounded by the stay put policy. And it seems to me that is the tragedy of it, that the more one's read over the weekend about the report and about the chances of people surviving, if you just ignore what you're told and leave, you are so much safer. And I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do.
And that's why I had to apologise to my colleague, because he got it right. Jacob Rees Mogg essentially did say that people who died in the Grenfell Tower tragedy died because they didn't follow the common sense thing to do. They obeyed the fire brigade's instructions. Let's get the phone lines open. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. I would like to confine comment initially to people either of the fire service or with a connection to the tower, to the tragedy. We may not sustain that requirement or that request, but I think to begin, that would be the respectful thing to do, and goodness knows, it's time that somebody adopted the respectful approach to this story. If you're a firefighter, what do you make of it? Let me talk you through what I believe to be true, okay? As someone who followed the Grenfell Tower story very closely and with an incredibly heavy and continuingly heavy heart, the stay put policy essentially, I think I've read, and please correct me if I've got this wrong, in 9 times out of 10, ignoring the stay put policy would increase the casualty count. You have the danger of stampeding, you have the danger of people getting stuck. We know that, for example, that night, although some people, we met, of course, a young man last week on the day that the report was published, Tiago, came in to tell us that, his dad did ignore the stay put requirement, but the reason he ignored it was because he'd been on the outside of the building. You see? Coming in. So although he knew what the official advice was, he also knew that the building was behaving in a way that nobody had foreseen or believed to be possible. That's the crucial point here. The fire brigade's advice is built upon the notion that a fire in a concrete block will be contained within a concrete unit because the concrete won't catch fire and therefore the flames will not spread. The cladding on the outside of Grenfell Tower drove a coach and horses through that, but nobody knew. This is what will emerge in the next chapter of the inquiry in more detail, but as it stands, it's fair to say nobody knew that. So if you were on the inside, or if you were operating an emergency phone line and talking to people on the inside, that is the policy that would be pursued. Now, there are questions to be answered, perhaps, by firefighters on the scene at the time, about why they didn't recognise that the nature of the spread of the fire would make a potential mockery of the stay-put policy, but the stay-put policy is the one that the fire service operates on. And Jacob Rees Mogg, I'm afraid I have to point out, was not talking specifically here. He said if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do. It takes quite a lot to stagger me. I think partly the scale of my shock is built upon the fact that I was being so arrogant earlier when I told my colleague to shut up and don't be ridiculous. There's no way he said that. And then it took a while for newspapers to pick up on it. I think because Rees Mogg's delivery is so drawling, perhaps, you don't notice the full, in this case, horror of what he's actually saying, because it is actually me falling into the trap that I keep accusing other people of falling into, because it's delivered in this cod patrician accent. You don't really notice the content, you only notice the context. It's why people can think that perhaps he's done well in an interview when he's had an absolute nightmare, because they are conditioned to think that posh people must prevail. So I didn't hear it, I don't think, and not notice, which would be remiss. I think I didn't hear it, full stop. But that's enough about me. You're a firefighter. Tell me what you think. The phone lines are open, 0345 6060 973. If either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do. Do you know, I remember when there was a bomb scare in the West End, I got caught up in it. And part of the reason for the panic was some poor fella off a reality TV show, I forget precisely who, but he had a shed load of followers on Twitter, claiming that the department store that he was in had been the target of some sort of bomb scare. And he'd got his facts horribly wrong, but it didn't stop the Chinese whispers going into overdrive. And I can't help wondering about the class angle here. I'm happy to be dismantled or contradicted, but if I'm trying to think of somebody of a different ilk, could you imagine if, I don't know, Stephen Yaxley Lennon had tried to blame the people killed in the Grenfell Tower tragedy for lacking common sense, or someone from the wrong side of the tracks possessed of very right-wing views as opposed to someone from the right side of the tracks. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. And also, you know, mea culpa. I didn't spot it myself until it was pointed out to me this morning. But we've seen it now, and we won't be looking away. 0345 6060 973. As a firefighter or as somebody closely connected to the Grenfell Tower tragedy, how would you respond to Jacob Rees Mogg's suggestion that disobeying the fire brigade just seems the common sense thing to do, and the implication therein that the dead bear some responsibility for their own fate? I see the implication. If you don't, again, you are not just welcome, but encouraged to call me. Although in the first instance, people of the fire service or people with a connection to the tragedy.
Just hours before the election campaign officially begins, the Prime Minister was forced into defending one of his cabinet members tonight, insisting he has full confidence in Jacob Rees Mogg. It follows comments he made saying Grenfell residents should have used their common sense and fled the building against fire brigade advice. 72 people died after fire engulfed the tower in June 2017. The Commons leader has now apologised, but campaigners say his words were insulting and there are calls for him to resign. Here's our political correspondent, Paul Brand.
Trust was one of the many things destroyed in the Grenfell fire. Today has done nothing to restore it. Among all the failures that led to 72 deaths here was a cabinet member really suggesting the victims lacked common sense.
I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do, and it is such a tragedy that that didn't happen.
Did those words lead to a few with the Prime Minister? This morning, he was one of the last out of Cabinet.
Mr Rees Mogg, do you really think Grenfell residents lacked common sense?
No, that's not what I said.
Do you regret your comments?
That's not what I said.
And a few minutes later, he was keen to clarify. I profoundly apologise, he wrote in a statement. What I meant to say is that I would have also listened to the fire brigade's advice to stay and wait at the time. However, with what we know now, and with hindsight, I wouldn't, and I don't think anyone else would. I would hate to upset the people of Grenfell if I was unclear in my comments. But the families here, who use a heart as their emblem, feel the government continues to lack one.
So basically saying that our families are stupid and lacked common sense. It's just ridiculous, incredibly insensitive. It just shows how detached the government is.
Out of step, just as it strides into the election.
What impression does this give of a Conservative Party if you've got one of your cabinet members saying that people in Grenfell Tower perhaps lacked common sense?
Jacob's apologised for his comments. You will need to refer any further questions to Jacob.
Jacob Rees Mogg is an absolute asset to the Conservative Party.
Is he? He's made quite a few gaffes.
Well, no, he's not made a few gaffes at all. And I think that as leader of the House, he's done a tremendous job.
Jacob Rees Mogg also still has the Prime Minister's confidence, but the danger in any election is knocking the public's. Paul Brand, ITV News, Westminster.
I don't know if this is a defence, or an explanation as opposed to an excuse. It's astonishing comments of Jacob Rees Mogg that the world is just waking up to, actually, as we broadcast live on the radio. Essentially, as Christian Gurumurthy of Channel 4 News puts it, essentially suggesting that the victims of the Grenfell Tower tragedy died because they lacked common sense. I just wonder whether or not it displays just a complete ignorance of what a tower block is like. A forgivable ignorance. The comments are unforgivable, in my view. But, you know, on this programme, we always try to look under the bonnet. It's just got absolutely no idea of what a tower block is like. Because if you live in a house and it is on fire, then of course you will run for the exits. But if you're on the 30th floor of a tower block, which is precisely the context and scenario that the stay put notices are designed to address, the world is a very different place. Now, you could probably make some class-based mileage from that, and I might do later in the programme, but I'm just leaving it there as an observation. If you don't know anything about a subject, stay stum. Clive's in Brixton. Clive, what do you reckon?
Yeah, a couple of points. I mean, you made a few valid points initially. Sorry. Hello. I didn't know.
But mate, in your own time, Clive.
You'll be nervous.
Sorry. Yeah, okay, I understand. Carry on. Well, first time for everything, Clive. A few valid points.
I'm a current firefighter.
Yes.
I've been in the job 12 years. And first of all, I mean, not saying I'm the fittest person in the world. There are a lot of fitter people than me. But when I walk up 20 flights of stairs, for example, to go up to a lift motor room,
yes,
without breathing apparatus on my back, I'm tired. I'm out of breath.
Yes.
So in a tower block like that, you've got young and fit people, you've got middle-aged people, you've got ladies who've just given birth, you've got elderly people. Walking down 20 flights of stairs, or 24 I believe from the top floor, is not really achievable under clean air and normal circumstances. In that tower block, on that night, I mean, we all know it wasn't a normal fire.
We do now.
We do now.
Yes.
I believe it was fairly evident a couple of hours in that it wasn't a normal fire, and there is it was acting the way it was acting.
And there's debate over whether or not that conclusion should have been reached earlier,
which hopefully will
we shall see.
Come to the conclusion.
Yes, and I know, for the record, I know a lot of families, there's division even among the survivors and the grieving families on this issue, but many families feel that Danny Cotton, the Chief Fire Officer, and indeed perhaps other officers should be held to account and punished for this, and some family members don't believe that. So, you know, this is not by any stretch of the imagination a black and white issue.
Well, personally, I believe that the fire brigade, all my colleagues and friends who went in there at night, did everything they could.
It will be a rare day.
As many people as possible.
Yeah, it'll be a very, very rare day that you hear me questioning or criticising that position, and nothing I've seen so far compels me to do so. But yeah, talk to me about these comments, this line here.
One thing to you. Do you know how many staircases there were in the whole of Grenfell?
Off the top of my head, yes. I mean, in terms of there was only one stairwell.
One stairwell?
Yes, I did know that.
Okay. So
and then imagine all of those people convening on it at more or less the same time.
Exactly.
And now we know why you have stay put notices.
In the melee, how many people would have not made it with the smoke? People who came out alive because the firefighters took off their breathing masks and put it on them and shared their air with them.
And people who did escape via the stairwell, and we met one of them last week, again, we reacquainted ourselves, wouldn't have got out if everybody else had been on the stairwell as well. So even that becomes a nuanced contribution to the conversation.
Exactly.
Let's move on to Jacob Rees Mogg. The suggestion that anybody with common sense would have ignored the fire brigade's advice.
I mean, it's ridiculous, personally, because anyone in those flats above the fourth floor, if they opened their window within a fairly short space of time of that fire breaking out and breaking out beyond the flat, the original flat, would have found a completely smoke-logged stairwell, whereas their flat would have been in clean air. So you're making a risk of going out. It will take about 2 lungfuls of that sort of smoke for you to be out unconscious on the floor.
And this is, to you as a firefighter, self-evident. Well, we shall see whether any of your colleagues, past or present, demur or disagree with your analysis. At the moment, I can't quite imagine it, but the phone lines remain open. Natasha Elcock is a survivor of that night, and she now chairs the bereaved and survivors group Grenfell United. Her uncle, who lived on the 15th floor, died that night, and Natasha, you, by the grace of whatever God you believe in, did not. How do you... I mean, first of all, when did you pick up on these comments? And secondly, how did they make you feel?
Hi, James. Yeah,
hey.
So yesterday evening, a message was sent through to us saying they were the comments that Jacob Rees Mogg, to be fair, I can't even say the man's name, made on Nick Ferrari yesterday morning, yes, and absolutely infuriated us. I mean, the fact that he can allude to that if common sense prevailed, then more people would have got out. I was one of those people that was faced with what happened that night. I made a call at 1:20 to the fire brigade, was told to stay where I was. It was under control. Maybe 15, 20 minutes later, we attempted to leave, and I can tell you on the 11th floor at that point, it was unescapable.
Is there any context in which you could, at least, perhaps not forgive, but understand Mr. Rees Mogg's contribution to this conversation?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It just shows the complete disregard, despite everything that's, been said in the report last week and all the news coverage, that you could say that common sense prevailed. No one that wasn't in that building that night can actually imagine what we were going through. No one can imagine. I was on relatively halfway up the building, lower down. I was unfortunate. I was rescued by the fire service. I was rescued by firefighters who risked their lives to come up for me. But for him to say if common sense had prevailed, then more people would have got out. If intelligent people, as he's put it...
That's how it feels. He didn't use the word intelligent. He just used the words common sense. But, join the dots.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that he thinks that's acceptable just shows the absolute disregard that he has for those that suffered from that tragedy.
What about the idea, and I'm not being the devil's advocate here, but he simply has no grasp of what a tower block is like. The idea of living on the 30th floor is beyond him, because he's never lived in a home that doesn't open onto street level immediately. That would perhaps give him a bit of a defence, no?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. We live in the UK, there's hundreds of tower blocks across the country. Just because he is what he deems privileged, or we all deem privileged, doesn't mean that he shouldn't understand. He's actually an MP. He represents people, no doubt. I'm not sure actually where he represents, but
Somerset, North Somerset.
Well, yeah. So probably not that many tower blocks, but that's what the social housing makeup is. There is lots of tower blocks, so therefore they should have at least a relatively decent understanding of what it's like to live in tower blocks, and especially after Grenfell, with so many buildings still covered in the cladding, he should have done his homework about what it feels like to live in tower blocks that are death traps.
I know you've touched on this, and forgive me if you don't want to go any further, but if you had displayed what Jacob Rees Mogg has elected to describe as common sense and disobeyed the fire brigade's instruction to stay put and tried to make your way out, what would have happened to you?
Well, for starters, there was unfortunately people passed away on the stairs. I know that because I had to go over that, and I was on a relatively low floor. Can you imagine what it was like higher up in the tower? That is all well and good, and I know we tripped on that particular person, so therefore we could have died had we not had the assistance of the fire brigade, had the firefighter not taken my daughter out of my partner's hands when we all tripped on that body. It's not as easy as saying, if everybody had used their common sense and left, there would have been people being trampled, because I can tell you I got down those stairs in a matter of seconds. And you're running for your life. But I knew there was firefighters there guiding us, so therefore, I felt a little bit safer at that point. But absolutely every opportunity we tried to get out that evening, there was absolutely no way. I couldn't see past my nose. It literally was thick.
Again, I can't quite understand how anyone who'd read any of the reports would have been unaware of much, not all, of course, because your account is first person, but much of what you describe has been in the public domain for the best part of 2.5 years.
Exactly. Exactly, and that... Yeah, I'm speechless. You don't understand the levels of infuriation. And,
I think I can come close, but you're right. I couldn't understand them fully, because it's not me or my dead relatives that he's insulting.
But this is the problem, 28 months on, we've all gone through commemorations. We've all had to go and give the public inquiry our witness statement. So, what we incurred that night, and for him to not even take that into account.
What can he do? Can he do anything to make amends?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Sorry is, for me, 28 months on, if I'm brutally honest, it's a really loose word, because that's all we've heard is sorry, sorry, sorry. But what we now need is those people that were responsible for the fire, who contributed to putting that material on the building. They need to be brought to justice, and that's as much as that's how sorry.
And that's
when everybody is held to account.
Yes, the next stage of the inquiry is expected or tasked with doing that. Before you go, Natasha, how are you getting on? How's the family getting on?
But no, yeah, you know, like many of the other families, everybody's suffering in one way or another. You know, children are suffering from PTSD, and this is why it hurts so much.
Of course.
Because, you know, you've got an 8-year-old that's having to go through therapy 2.5 years on because she's suffering from the experience of that night. You know, and that she's not the only child. There's many other children that escaped that evening that are suffering. And for me, yeah, I mean, we will fight on. You know, we're not going anywhere. We will make sure that everybody that is involved in this tragedy is held to account, and that's from the top right the way down to the bottom. We will not give up this fight.
And you know, you've always got a platform and a microphone here. Natasha Elcock from Grenfell United, the chair, indeed, of the Bereaved and Survivors Group, just responding very, well, understandably perhaps, to Jacob Rees Mogg's astonishing suggestion that the 72 people who died in the fire, or at least the 55 of the 72 who died in the fire after being told to remain in their flats, somehow lacked common sense. If you ignore what you're told and leave, you are so much safer. 10:31 is the time. If you just ignore what you're told and leave, you are so much safer, said Jacob Rees Mogg yesterday, suggesting that the people who died on the night of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, 72 in total, of course, somehow lacked common sense. Very, very simply, smoke inhalation is the biggest killer, I believe, in fire-related deaths. And the stay-put policy is designed to minimise smoke inhalation. It's designed for buildings that, of course, haven't been covered in horrifically flammable cladding. But we are where we are, and this is the comment that Jacob Rees Mogg saw fit to make yesterday. The problem with using Google on days like today is that it is obviously dominated by the burgeoning coverage of this disgraceful intervention. So I can't find... I'm just looking for at times when Jacob Rees Mogg has either spoken up about the continuing failure to remove any comparable claddings from every building in the land. If you've got any evidence of him ever having done that in Parliament or in media interviews, acknowledging the urgency of that action and questioning the government's failure, because, you know, as we saw when Theresa May was Prime Minister, he's not reluctant to criticise his own Prime Ministers, Conservative Prime Ministers. So any comment on the failure to remove cladding or any evidence, and you could ring in and provide this, it's a good faith invitation, of Jacob Rees Mogg actually talking to anybody attached to Grenfell Tower. Either a survivor or perhaps a firefighter who... I know we've got a doctor waiting to talk to us who was on duty that... or not on duty that night, but who ran back to work at a local hospital. So anybody whose insights, memories, contributions Jacob Rees Mogg has personally sought out, I'd love to perhaps offer up some defence of the man by pointing out that he has done either of those things. Commented publicly upon the continuing failure to properly address the issue of flammable cladding, and or sought out counsel or testimony from survivors of or emergency service professionals involved with the Grenfell Tower tragedy, because otherwise, if he gets asked a question about it, he should just stay silent. Surely, what is this based upon? Incorrigible FCA suggests it's based upon the views of many right-wing people. When it comes to the poor, all they suffer must be their own fault. If they had common sense, they'd have more money and live better lives, but they don't, so they die from their ignorance. Strong analysis, but it's the corollary, of course, of the notion that people sometimes have, born into epic privilege and inherited wealth, that somehow it's their talents that have propelled them to their station in life. The phrase I always like is that they were born on third base and they think they've scored a home run. And the other side of that coin, of course, in a profoundly unequal and unjust society, is that people on the wrong side of the inequality have only got themselves to blame, while people on the right side of it have somehow triumphed as a result of their innate gifts and talents. One of the great benefits of being sent to a public school is that you know that that's nonsense, because you know that your classmates at public school are in no way more talented or gifted or possessed of potential than your mates from humbler backgrounds or humbler educations. That's why our parents pay fortunes to give us that start in life. But many, I don't know if this is a fair criticism of Jacob Rees Mogg, but many people of that ilk certainly subscribe to that school of thought. Liam is in Bracknell. Liam, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Nice to talk to you. I just can't get my head around this comments by Jacob Rees Mogg, and I think it's pretty obvious what's going on here, and it's a systematic dilution of blame, and it all started with holding the inquiry for the LFB first.
The sequencing that Sir Martin Moore-Bick undertook, I understand why you say that, but he, of course, would furiously refute it, and I have to put that out there.
Okay, fine, but he's wrong. Then it was the first officer in charge, then we move on to Danny Cotton, and then we move on to the state put policy. Even the survivors, they've managed to turn them against us in some circumstances. And now it's the residents' faults for not leaving the block. And what we're doing here is, by the time it gets to the people who were responsible, the councils and the corporations, it won't be so bad for them. And I think it's as simple as that. And I just think it's
you can't. I mean, I don't disagree with much of what you've said, but some of it is unprovable. And the idea, I mean, there's certainly no, I don't think, secret meetings between people planning to try to pass the buck away from the agencies that will be examined in the next stage of the inquiry. But I also have to tell you that... How many
years is that going to take?
Well, I don't know, but Moore-Bick's rationale, and it's one that I find persuasive, is that you can't, until you actually establish precisely what happened on the night, then you can't start examining the rearview mirror, metaphorically speaking. But only time will tell whether your cynicism or my, shall we say, naivety is most relevant here. I'll just read you a comment from someone called Nick in Weybridge, who says that you're just creating yet more polarisation to suit your political leanings and dislike of Jacob Rees Mogg. Far better to focus on resolutions for tower blocks than a comment that has been shaped to create phone calls. The idea that Rees Mogg doesn't deserve criticism from me or indeed you, Liam. How do you respond to that suggestion?
No, I think he should be held to account for comments like that. They're totally unacceptable, absolutely ridiculous. Obviously, he doesn't know what it was like there. You know, the staircase was 1 metre wide. It was full of toxic smoke. There was water cascading down it. It was like a waterfall. There was bodies clogging up the stairwell. You know,
were you there that night?
I wasn't there on the night. I was there all day the next day.
Did you know, that's so typical of your lot. And I think in most lines of work, if I'd said, were you there on the night, and you were there the next day, you'd have said yes. But of course, when you're a firefighter, there's this attention to detail and this technical definition is key and crucial. So you dealt with the immediate aftermath of the tragedy.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
And I wouldn't want to have gone through what the Red Watch did that night. You know.
No, and that's why these comments, unless we can find a more charitable light in which to view them, perhaps Nick in Weybridge could get back in touch. The idea that if you buried somebody, or perhaps not even, forgive me for this, but I think it's important to remind ourselves, not even had enough of your loved one left to bury, to wake up this morning and find a senior member of Boris Johnson's government suggesting that they died because they lacked common sense. 10:43 is the time. Mohammed is in Kensington. Mohammed, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. I was one of the doctors, actually. I was off duty that day. I was around the area and I just heard about what had happened on the news. I'm usually spend quite a lot of time around Latimer Road and the Grenfell area. So when I recognised the area, I drove right there. There were, obviously, as you were aware, lots of ambulances at that time, and HEMS, which was the hospital, the helicopter medics were there, and the fire brigade, obviously. So offering my services, they said, we've got enough people on the ground, and they did at that time. So they sort of suggested I go back into work, or I suggested, I'd asked which hospital it was going to. So they said Royal Free, and that's where I was working at the time. So headed over there. Now, at that time, it was a quiet night just before that, but going in, I kind of knew what was coming in at that time. We looked after the patients who'd come into the hospital that night. It was one of the nearby hospitals that was triaged patients. And I'd had to look after some of the patients coming from Grenfell, dealing with them with the problems of smoke inhalation specifically. And the reason I called in was because I dealt with some of those people that had run down the stairwell and had become, inhaled toxic levels of smoke. And their descriptions of what was happening that night would haunt anyone, but essentially it was pitch black. They were running down pitch black stairwells. It was screams all along, and the patient, and no one could see anyone. So the thought that, this person on his high horse can just go out there saying that, you'd actively want to run into that kind of situation, and it was actually common sense that stopped them from doing that. It's just so much contempt for the people.
That is a leap. I mean, I don't see evidence of contempt in perhaps the sense you mean. I mean, certainly there's contempt involved in not thinking through comments about a tragedy of this scale. But, live radio can be an exacting medium, and the glare of the proverbial headlights can make us all freeze, perhaps, and say. So I don't know that are you confident that contempt is the right word to use?
I mean, you're right. It might be a complete stretch, but I think anyone who had even just, spoken a few moments with any of the survivors and just talked to them about their experiences, they wouldn't want to put any sort of comments like that out in the public eye. The thought that adds to any of the discourse in any way or helps any of the survivors in any way, that's what I find shocking.
And, I suppose the question of whether anyone who'd spent any time listening to or reading about the actual realities of that night could have made these comments, you're going to be squarely on the side that it would have been almost unthinkable for anyone who'd spoken to anybody involved in the tragedy, either as a professional like yourself or as a resident or a neighbour, like many others, to have made a comment like this. I mean,
exactly. There are so many other sort of things to go down and lines of inquiry that obviously we're going to have to wait for the full Grenfell inquiry to see what could have been done. But just the thought that, these incredibly traumatized people, that it was their fault, it's just, just absolutely breathtaking that you could go and actually try and sort of make that one of your arguing points.
Well, we now live in a country where cabinet ministers are waltzing around telling people to ignore, if they find themselves in a fire, ignore the advice of the fire brigade.
Exactly.
I mean, there's an echo there of course, just ignore the experts and leave, but it's probably not an appropriate moment to focus in on that. Mohammed, thanks for everything you did and everything you continue to do. 10:47 is the time. Absolutely unbelievable comments. And it's funny, I do occasionally, as you know, I have an academic interest in the toxic underbelly of our society that has enjoyed such a period in the sun over the last 3 or 4 years. And that story that you just heard from Greece of the Afghan men and boys being found in the back of a refrigerated truck. My podcast this week on Full Disclosure with Gulwali Pasale tells the story of getting from Afghanistan to Britain, parts of the journey undertaken in a refrigerated truck, and he speaks very coolly, calmly, but for me, powerfully about that experience and how people end up taking these risks. And it's quite odd to see the predictably toxic replies to that on the LBC Twitter feed seem to echo a lot of people sticking up for Jacob Rees Mogg today. I can't think why that might be. It's 10:48. Are Rees Mogg's comments a purely disgusting planned distraction from the Russia interference report? He's now topped #Russia report as a Twitter trend, and surely they're running out of shock tactics that will successfully gaslight listeners and readers, asks Dabla on Twitter. I mean, with the greatest of love and respect, do calm down. You're not alone. Robert has just tweeted to say, and nobody is talking about the Russia report as if there is some sort of master plan in place here. I assure you that, well, I'm 99% certain there is no such master plan in place. And anyway, time now to talk about this Russia report. Dominic Grieve is the independent MP for Beaconsfield, former Attorney General, and more pertinent to our conversation this morning, Chair of the Security and Intelligence Committee. So it is your committee, which I think uniquely meets in secret, that has put together a report, a 50-page dossier, looking at the Russian infiltration of British politics, including the Conservative Party. Is that right so far, Dominic?
Not quite. The report is about the threat posed by Russia.
Right.
And it covers a wide range of issues, not just about subversion or penetration of political institutions or anything of that kind. It covers espionage. It covers Russia's role in assassinating people in this country, Russia's threat to our partners in our near abroad. It is a wide-ranging report on the challenge posed by Russia and whether we have the right intelligence and security measures in place to try to counter it. That's what the report is all about. And part of that does deal, as I explained when I took my point of order on Thursday, in issues surrounding Russia's attempts to subvert electoral processes. And I want to emphasize, we know, and I think as a matter of fact, that Russia has done this in other countries, but one of the issues that we've been looking at is about the risks or the events that in this country and whether Russia has such an involvement. So that's what the report is about. So it's a wide-ranging report.
Yes.
This report ought to have been published ought to have been published today, but ought to have been given clearance last Thursday. With a report of this sort, what happens is that we prepare it, we take witness evidence. When it's all ready, we go through quite a complicated process that takes several months, where we redact it, or at least discuss it with the intelligence agencies to make sure that there's nothing that appears in the public report which could endanger national security. And that process is a bit like a game of ping pong. The intelligence agencies will come up with some concerns, we will respond to them, and then we may do it again if necessary. And what happens is at the end of it, we arrive at a consensus as to how the report can be presented to the public. That process was finished in the early part of October. And on the 17th of October, we then submitted the report in its final form for publication, as well as the version which will not see the light of day, to the Prime Minister, so that the Prime Minister can sign it off. The Prime Minister has the right to veto publication, but this has never happened previously, and if he is to do it, then he has to give an explanation why to us. And the protocol is that final bit of the process takes 10 days. And one of the reasons why we dealt with it quickly in the final stages, because we wanted to get it out, because we thought there might be a general election. And if there is one, this report probably won't see the light of day for another 6 months, if ever. So for that reason, we want it out. And
why do you say that? Why would a general election see it?
Because once a general election has been called, we cannot publish it. We have to lay it before Parliament when Parliament is sitting, and even after the election, it can only be done when the committee is operational, and usually it takes up to 5, even 6 months to get the committee going again.
I understand. And yet, surely if I'm presumably infiltration, including of electoral processes or seeking to influence elections, it would, to most people in a rational universe, seem urgent to publish something that might...
I think it would be very informative and helpful for the public that this should come out before an election, seeing that there has been a lot of public disquiet expressed about such risks relating to elections. So it's clearly germane to a general election, and that was one of the reasons why we wanted to get it out. So that's why I've been so utterly disappointed and horrified, really, about the government's response.
Well, what reasons have they given you for not?
Well, they haven't given us a reason. The only reason they've given is an entirely incredible one. They've returned and said, not, we don't want to publish this because there's an overarching national security reason for not doing so, which in my view doesn't exist anyway. They've come back and said, oh, no, we haven't had anything like enough time to consider this. This has to go through a very complex process to ensure that it's ready for publication. But this complex process has already happened.
You've done it.
There is, and indeed today, I note that in one newspaper it suggested that the agencies themselves have said there is nothing to prevent this report coming out. They're completely satisfied it is now in a publishable form. So all this is bogus. And this also worries me, because this is a government which seems, through its spokesman at number 10, to keep on coming out with bogus explanations about anything which doesn't appear to suit them at any given moment. And I find this form of government really rather worrying. I mean, historically, UK governments, and they may sometimes not tell the whole truth, but they don't go around saying things which are utterly and completely idiotically wrong.
Well, you're not pulling your punches today, Dominic.
No,
I mean, what are you allowed to tell me? I mean, if I were to say to you, does the report address the possibility of Russian influence or Russian infiltration of the Vote Leave campaign? Could you answer that in the affirmative?
No, I won't answer it, I'm afraid.
Okay. I'm just looking for reasons why they might want to keep a lid on things.
I'm afraid I'm not in a position to say that, because that would then start to leak parts of the report. And that was something else which irritated me. They started suggesting that we had leaked parts of the report, which was outrageous, actually, because we haven't. I mean, there's been a bit of press speculation, and there are some commentators who have their own sources elsewhere and believe that they happen to know what some of the issues are about. But that's quite a different... That's always going to happen. None of this report has been leaked. I haven't seen any suggestion anywhere.
No, nor have I.
No.
And again, you probably can't even answer this, but I'll chance my arm. How... Because one wonders, looking at Donald Trump's way of dealing with potentially embarrassing information, if you postpone and prevaricate, then when finally it does emerge, it can hardly live up to the hype, if you follow what I mean.
Well, I think you may... this is an interesting point.
Yes.
I do worry that there is a pattern of government behaviour which raises temperature and then reduces it. And whether this is planned, I simply don't know. But I found it one of the most alarming aspects of the way this government has behaved, as I've watched it over the last 2 months since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, that we seem to have this tendency to create these sort of firestorms of disinformation, which are designed to sort of obscure the facts. And when they finally come out, to mean that the facts have lost their clarity, or that they can be rubbished in some other way. And that does worry me very much. It's not the only example, because if you remember in September, we had this extraordinary assertion by Number 10, which concerned me personally, that we were in the pay of foreign governments and that we were going to be investigated by the government over the passage of the Ben Act. And, a week later, I had a letter from the Cabinet Secretary saying, of course, there's no investigation. But the fact is that Number 10 was prepared to put all this rubbish out quite deliberately in order, firstly, to blacken me and also Oliver Letwin and Hilary Benn. I mean, this is all nonsense. And this is part, and there are other examples.
And nobody gets held to account for that in most lines of work. Most people listening to this, if they did that at work, they'd expect to be punished pretty severely.
Yeah.
And in conclusion, so we're not going to see it, are we? That's the bottom line. We're not, as it stands, we're not going to see this report. And the reason they've given, sorry to interrupt, but the reason they've given you as chair of the relevant select committee, you dismiss it as you've used the word bogus. You're calling them liars.
Well, it is bogus, yes. I mean, they are not telling... If there is a reason, then the Prime Minister should give it. They have the reason which they've given, which is, this is too complicated and delay, is bogus. Yes, it's just untrue.
Because the long clearance process that began in late March has now been completed.
Yes, absolutely. It doesn't need more. It doesn't need more time. The Prime Minister could take a view on this and has had ample time. He's had over 2 weeks.
All right, one last try.
Nearly 3 weeks.
One last try. I mean, would the report that you, essentially authored as chair of the Select Committee, would it be personally embarrassing to the Prime Minister if it were published?
I have no idea if it would be personally embarrassing to the Prime Minister if it were published. It's a report. That's all I could say. I won't be drawn on that.
No, well, they wouldn't pay me this week if I didn't try. Thank you very much indeed, Dominic Grieve, independent MP, of course, for Beaconsfield, and it's worth bearing in mind not just the former Attorney General, but the chair of the Security and Intelligence Committee, describing the government's explanation for failing to publish a potentially important and fascinating report as bogus, and really in the strongest imaginable terms. It's 2 minutes after 11. I'm hearing that Jacob Rees Mogg has apologised to all of the people he insulted. We'll find out after the news whether his apology contains a but or perhaps the phrase "what I meant to say" or something of that nature. Approximately an hour since we began the programme with a sense of incredulity at comments that we missed Jacob Rees Mogg making on this radio station yesterday about the Grenfell Tower tragedy. He has now issued an apology. Quite why he didn't do so sooner is, I suppose, between him and his father confessor. I'll remind you of what he actually said, then I shall share the apology with you. And my opinion of Jacob Rees Mogg is quite well documented, so I shall withhold judgment on whether the apology is in any way adequate. I won't tell you my views or thoughts. I might invite yours, depending. So let's remind ourselves of what he said in this studio yesterday.
The tragedy came about because of the cladding leading to the fire racing up the building, and then was compounded by the stay put policy. And it seems to me that that is the tragedy of it, that the more one's read over the weekend about the report and about the chances of people surviving, if you just ignore what you're told and leave, you are so much safer. And I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do.
I'm going to struggle to withhold judgment, actually. Just listen to that again and focus on the sentence that begins with the word, if either of us were in a fire. If either of us were in a fire.
The tragedy came about because of the cladding leading to the fire racing up the building, and then was compounded by the stay put policy. And it seems to me that that is the tragedy of it, that the more one's read over the weekend about the report and about the chances of people surviving, if you just ignore what you're told and leave, you are so much safer. And I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do.
If either of us were in a fire, if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would just leave the burning building. So comments that have caused grave upset to people who've already, I think we could all agree, suffered more than anyone should. And here's the apology. I profoundly apologise. What I meant to say is that I would have also listened to the fire brigade's advice to stay and wait at the time. However, with what we know and with hindsight, I wouldn't, and I don't think anyone else would. I would hate to upset the people of Grenfell if I was unclear in my comments. Oh, I don't think you need to worry unduly about that. I think you were perfectly clear in your comments. You said that if you were in a fire, you would ignore the fire brigade and leave the building. You also said that would be the common sense thing to do. You were not, I don't think, speaking in the way that your apology would claim. Again, I'm open to correction or persuasion or whatever it may be, but this is horrible, this story, and it's incontrovertibly not the case that you were speaking with hindsight about the specific events of that night. If you just ignore what you're told and leave, you are so much safer. Not if you had ignored what you were told and had left, you would have been so much safer. I mean, he's a stickler for language, isn't he, Rees Mogg? Perhaps he'd have been better off doing this apology in Latin. I said I wouldn't actually make a judgment. I'll leave you to do so. So there are the comments. Grenfell residents who followed firefighters' instructions to stay put lacked common sense. But I would hate to upset the people of Grenfell if, I say to my children, it's not an apology if it's got an if or a but in it, if I was unclear in my comments. Back to the phones on this. Either looking at the broader offence caused by the Cabinet Minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg, or at the adequacy or otherwise of this apology. And I will take calls again from people in the fire service, or as our friend Mohammed reminded us, other emergency service professionals, an A&E doctor who went back to work off duty that night at the Royal Free Hospital, or, of course, families, friends, relatives, neighbours of people in the tower or people who themselves did survive the fire. Ryan is in Reading. Ryan, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I don't think he understands the danger that he's putting thousands of people in, just sticking that little bit of information into their heads. I mean, to make people think that the best idea is to run down that stairwell. We've already heard from other firefighters to say what that stairwell was like. I mean, you're not going to get many people that actually know what they're talking about are going to, for a second, that he's give him any leeway, really. it's dangerous stuff saying that people should just leave the building. It's the best advice is to stay where you are.
Yes. And 9 times out of 10, that will be the best advice. That's the number I've got.
Even 9 times out of 10.
Go on.
You know, how many buildings across the country have got flammable cladding around them? I mean, there will be a handful. Think of the amount of tower blocks that we've got, and how many of those are actually in that dangerous state. It's that. You know, it was a freak, awful accident that I know you use the word advisedly, but accidents, people don't bear responsibility for accidents often, and I know you don't mean this, but some people listening will be very keen to remind us that they want people to be held accountable and responsible for decisions taken. Yeah, it's another thing that gets annoyed, is when the blame starts to get thrown around.
Yes.
There's been other comments in the news recently of blame of how the things would have been dealt with differently if, and it's probably not the time now, but other people making comments of racism and things like that, which is just unbelievable when you've got firefighters that want to risk their lives to go and save people. They want to give the best advice to people in the control rooms as well. We've not really spoken about them much. They're telling these people that are stuck in these rooms the best advice possible for most fires in tower blocks, and those people died. And we've got people, working in control rooms that, have got to live with that for the rest of their life, The advice was the best advice. It still is the best advice.
And it was the circumstances of that specific conflagration that rendered the situation more complicated than the advice would ordinarily allow. Blimey, I'm sounding like a lawyer now. Just let me read you the comments and then the apology, and you tell me, as a firefighter, whether or not you feel that the apology actually addresses what he said or addresses some mythical comment that he never made at all. And I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do. And then the apology. What I meant to say is that I would have also listened to the fire brigade's advice to stay and wait at the time. However, with what we know now and with hindsight, I wouldn't, and I don't think anyone else would.
Yeah, I mean, the guy obviously has no idea. Again, some of the firefighters said earlier on what that stairwell would have been like. Yeah. That if you've ever, anyone that knows what those stairwells will be like, forget about casualties, just the amount of equipment and fire service resources that would be clogging that stairwell. Anyone that has any idea that the thought of running down that stairwell with all that equipment alone is dangerous enough, let alone turn the lights out, fill it full of toxic smoke. Just no idea at all of the dangers. I can't
quite conceive of saying... I don't like saying this, Ryan, but I can get my head around why you and your colleagues will face or may face criticism after a tragedy has happened, because, people will be pursuing perfect resolutions and perfect responses, even if that's unrealistic. I can't quite get my head around how anybody could ever say anything that in any way casts aspersions upon the judgments or the behaviour of people who died. I'm really struggling I'm such a snowflake. I'm trying to find a way of casting his words in a way that doesn't lead to that conclusion, but at the moment I can't. He's criticising dead people for not having common sense.
Yeah, which is crazy. They're being told the best advice that the control room knew at the time, and it's still the best advice for the 99.999% of fires in tower blocks. One of the other earlier firefighters said, if you're in your flat and it's relatively clean air in your flat, and you open your doorway to your stairwell and it's full of toxic smoke. I mean, to say that common sense that you would run down that stairwell in the dark with all that equipment and everything else in the way is just craziness. It's disgusting.
Well, it certainly looks that way, and this apology is his only public comment on the matter so far. And I'd remind you again that the comments he apologising for contain the phrase, if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. And the apology says, what I meant to say is that I would have also listened to the fire brigade's advice to stay and wait at the time. So no judgment from me, but I will add this question to the mix. Has he made it worse? 0345 6060973. Has this, quotes, apology, end quotes, actually compounded the original offence? Your thoughts, please, on 0345 973. I've got 2 phone lines free at the moment. So, again, I do want to confine the conversation to firefighters and people attached to Grenfell. But for that second question, has he made it worse? We may throw on that a little wider. It's 11:17. Those 2 words, Dominic Cummings, or Demonic Cummings, as a couple of trick-or-treaters round our way played it on Halloween. It strikes me we should probably find out a little bit more about him. He has been mentioned obliquely in the context of that Russia report and the decision of Downing Street to put out what a former Conservative Attorney General describing a Conservative Prime Minister's office as essentially lying, so putting out bogus information, both about him, in the case of Dominic Grieve, and about the report that his select committee have put together regarding Russian interference in the British body politic. He also, of course, would have been crucial in the decision to put Jacob Rees Mogg front and centre during the election campaign. And we know that he was a key player in the Vote Leave campaign. Dominic Cummings, in many ways, patron saint of unaccountable bureaucrats, who now sits at the very, very heart of the British government. So there are a few little signposts on his CV that we will do our best to find. Obviously, once election period kicks in proper tomorrow, we have to tread a little bit carefully. But I'm always a huge believer in the power of people's own words to tell you what you want to know about them. So here are some of Dominic Cummings' own words.
People think, by the way, and I think most people are right, the Tory party is run by people who basically don't care about people like me, right? That's what most people in the country have thought about the Tory party for decades. I know a lot of Tory MPs, and I'm sad to say the public is basically correct. Tory MPs largely do not care about these poor people. They don't care about the NHS, and the public kind of has cottoned on to that.
Interesting, though. The Prime Minister's senior source, key advisor, consigliere, saying he knows a lot of Tory MPs and they don't care about poorer people. And now we come back to Jacob Rees Mogg's comments about people who died on the night of the Grenfell Tower tragedy and his attempted apology for offending them on an egregious and still, to me, unbelievable level. So the phrase, the crucial phrase, I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, he was talking, of course, to my friend and colleague Nick Ferrari, who was nowhere near Grenfell Tower on the night of the tragedy, so this theoretical fire. And I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do. And now the apology. What I meant to say is that I would have also listened to the fire brigade's advice to stay and wait at the time. However, with what we know now and with hindsight, I wouldn't, and I don't think anyone else would. And then you get the almost inevitable if. I would hate to upset the people of Grenfell if I was unclear in my comments. If you weren't unclear in your comments, you wouldn't be profoundly apologising for them, would you? So the last sentence could have been, or the second half of the last sentence could have been easily dispensed with. Some would argue that that would have been perhaps honourable. But here we are. Mark's in Bristol. Mark, what made you pick up the phone?
I just think it's bringing the points back about common sense and about the whole evacuation on the night, James. I mean, I read with interest some time ago about an incident at Bethnal Green Tube Station in 1943, yes, where people were going down into the air raid shelter for fear of the bombings, and a new ACAT gun went off, and as it was firing off, they'd never heard the sound, so they ran down the stairs. Someone tripped on the stairs. They then started to pile up on the stairs, and on that night, in a very short space of time, 175 people lost their life. Yes. Now, you know, you have a caller on earlier who was talking about...
That's why we say peacetime tragedy, isn't it? I mean, one of the reasons, the 72 people that died that night, overshadowed only by casualty counts during wartime events, wartime tragedies.
And yeah, on that, ironically, on that particular night, no bombs actually fell on that area of London at all. Anyway, they were killed. So it's a travesty. Now, come back to Grenfell and the rationale around stay put. You know, the fire service have worked tirelessly to campaign to get the buildings to be safer. From the Lakenhall fire, and there's numbers of others that have been quoted, where stay put is the right thing to do if the building is prepared properly. The fire crews, work tirelessly to get in that premises and then try to save life. But what they wouldn't be able to do, is rescue people and make further advances to try to put that fire out. If that stairwell had been logged with people, there's a million what ifs. But I think the fire service has come under such criticism that's unfair in the last, 3-4 weeks since just prior to the report from Brian Lawrence's comments about potential racism in there.
She's apologised for those. I'm delighted to tell you.
She has, and I think every firefighter up and down the land is glad of that.
Yes,
because
and it was a proper apology. It was a gracious, graceful, unstinting apology.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but I think with Jacob, he just pushes things too far now. It's
I can't believe, man. I just can't. I mean, goodness knows I don't hold a candle for the man, but I can't believe that you talk about a tragedy that killed 72 people and cast aspersions on the dead. I know you lads don't like this much, but I understand why the firefighters have to be examined, and I understand why one woman in particular who I interviewed at the time, who lost her mother and her aunt, she really does hold firefighters responsible for her relatives' deaths. I think she's wrong to do so, but I would never deprive her of the right to say that that's how she feels or to believe what she believes. But I can't transfer that to the actual dead people. Having a problem with how the firefighters behaved, sad, in my view unfair, but inevitable. Having a problem with how the dead people behaved, casting aspersions on their common sense. What have we become?
The problem is, James, that I think one of your callers earlier hit the nail on the head. I know you said there's no evidence of it, but I think it is pushing it towards a cover-up. If you can blame everyone else apart from government, apart from the changes of regulations, apart from the...
The pressure's on for the next bit. The pressure is on for the next bit of the inquiry.
Some people are going to have to take a huge hit, a huge fall out of this, because it cannot be the emergency services. At the moment, there seems to be a huge ambush going on towards the fire service.
I think you're wrong, but I don't know whether I am hoping you're wrong and therefore thinking you're wrong, or whether I am genuinely thinking you're wrong. But we will neither of us know.
James.
And I will continue to be. But then, you say things like that. I think it sounds a little bit too conspiratorial. And then we look at issues like Hillsborough or Orgreave, and, well, you do the maths, as the Americans say. Mark, thank you, mate. I appreciate the call. Stuart's in Watford. Stuart, what's on your mind?
Hi, James. I've been a firefighter in Watford for the best part of 15 years. We're Hertfordshire. We didn't attend Grenfell, obviously, but I've spoken to people who have. And from my point of view, Jacob Rees Mogg, do you know what? I'm not surprised at all that he said what he said and he's had to backtrack as quick as he said it. I think somebody who lives their life... I'm not going to cast aspersions on Jacob Rees Mogg, but I imagine it's somewhat sheltered to sort of normal life and what, the general public have to, the tragedy some people might come across. So maybe that blasé comment, I can understand that he said that. But what he's done, the damage he's done, is that since Grenfell Tower, we have high-rise in certain parts of Watford and our station ground. And we have, we're talking 15, 16 stories high. Over the years, we've had many, many small instances, usually false alarms, usually a bit of smoke log, usually nothing at all. But we implement a high-rise procedure, par for the course, prepare for the worst.
Yeah.
Since Grenfell Tower, all we have to do is pull up in the car park of these high-rise buildings, which are in less affluent areas, let's say, pull up in the car park of these areas, and we're already having people come down the stairs scared, who see a fire engine and automatically think there's a problem, leave the building.
I see where you're going with this. God forbid that you're right.
For sure. So to instill more panic and more fear, more distrust in the fire service, let's be frank, an apology is...
Is it an apology? Does it deserve the description apology? What I meant to say is that I would have also listened to the fire brigade's advice to stay and wait at the time. However, with what we know now and with hindsight, I wouldn't, and I don't think anyone else would. And here's what he said, and I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do.
I mean, I think that what you have to realise is this is the worst day, the most harrowing day of every one of those people's lives as that unfolds.
They're the lucky ones.
then they're the lucky ones. The no visit. See, this is the other thing that frustrates me, is when you talk about leaving your flat as if you can just walk out to the foyer, press a button, get in a lift and pop down to the lobby. I struggle with that. Even if some of the photos of the aftermath with these huge amounts of hose trailing up the stairs, the water cascading...
But this is the point. Everybody knows this, if they've even paid cursory attention. He claimed he'd been reading the reports all weekend. I just don't get how you can...
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been to some quite minor incidents with buildings half the size of Grenfell Tower over the years, and the panic just because someone's burnt their toast and the amount of smoke that creates, people, they almost turn into sort of children again and they're just waiting for instruction because none of them have ever been in that sort of situation before, thankfully. So they're just almost waiting to soak up that instruction and do what they're told.
Yes, of course.
Because that's one of the requirements of being in the fire service, is that you have that training and information, obviously. But to think that people could just leave their flat, turn left, walk down the stairs, we're talking zero visibility. We're literally talking you cannot see your hand in front of your face.
I spoke to people in the immediate aftermath, and that was one of the first lessons we learned, actually, was that the language was inappropriate and inadequate to describe the reality. But that was a lesson we learned. It's a lesson that you know every day. It's a lesson Jacob Rees Mogg apparently still fails fully to appreciate. A couple of quick texts before we head to the news. Sorry, James, but you're wrong. Jacob thinks he's better than us. He exudes total arrogance, dines with white supremacists. He is utterly despicable and worthy of contempt. Again, feel free to challenge that contribution. Here's an interesting one, for a tweet from an idle man. It says, James, listen to Rees Mogg's subtle cough and the emphasis on people like us. He doesn't say people like us. He says, if either of us were in a fire. So the us is the one you've capitalised. A real case of them and us being totally different in his mind. I see the point you're making, is suggesting that if either of us were in a fire, we'd have the common sense. It just seems the common sense thing to do. It's such a tragedy that didn't happen. It's such a tragedy that the dead people didn't have our common sense. So I understand the point you're making. I'm not going to endorse or dismiss it.